Yeah, so it's 500 billion more people than have ever lived on the earth, basically. And so that's the power of what you're talking about. And well, today I have the privilege of interviewing Sean McDowell. He should need no introduction on this channel. He's written, I think, over 20 books. Is that right?
Something like that, written or co-written or edited.
Wow. So yeah, we have Sean on today. He's been married over 23 years, has 3 children. Thank you so much for coming on the channel today, Sean.
Honored to do it. Happy to be here.
So a few months ago, I was rereading the book that you and your father have written here, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, one of the updates. I think there's a number of updates actually, but for those of you that haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And it's one of those, I put books into different categories, and this one is what I call a hoardable book. It's one that, down the road, years to come, I'm going to have it in my library, and I'm going to hold on to it if my wife tells me, it's time to clean up the library and get rid of some of the books I'm not going to read again. So it's in the hoardable book category if you haven't read it. One of the things that struck me as I was reading it, one is just the good content, but was the fact that you wrote this, your co-author with your father. So what was it like to grow up in a household where apologetics and biblical worldview was important?
First off, I'm glad you said horrible rather than horrible. The
Yes,
change in one syllable could change everything, but I
absolutely.
digress. You know, Wherever we grow up, we just kind of think it's the norm for us, and we don't really realize how different it is. And that was especially the case for me. The older I get, the more I realize, like, wow, I had a pretty unique place and time and parents that I grew up under. I would say my parents never put pressure on me. I don't remember one time, Mike, that my dad said, "Son, you'd be a good speaker. Son, you ought to write a book. You should follow in my footsteps." I don't ever remember that. If he said that, I literally just missed it. The narrative, if I had to describe it, was, "Son, God's give you different giftings. Just use them for the kingdom." One time I remember telling my dad, I was like, "I don't know if I'd be a really good lawyer." He goes, "Son, you'd be a great lawyer." He said, "You'd be awesome. But if you became a lawyer, use it for the kingdom." When I wanted to coach, he's like, "Coach, use it for the kingdom." So that really freed me up in a sense to decide ultimately what I wanted to do, and in a sense to follow my father's footsteps. I think if he had pressured me, probably my stubbornness being younger would have been like, "I'm going a different direction." And I think he also understood there's a certain weight in doing apologetics, having a public ministry, there's a responsibility. And if you're not in that for the right reasons, ultimately it's going to come back and hurt yourself and hurt others. So that was just my life growing up. And I can tell you, it's funny. Just yesterday, I was doing filming, and a fellow told me, he goes, "When your dad was in, I think he said graduate school, he dated my sister and took her to Disneyland for the day. And she was watching your dad asking, is this guy legit?" And he's sharing the faith with people in line at Disneyland. And she's like, "Wow, this guy's the real deal." That's my experience, Mike. This wasn't something he did on stage. It wasn't something he did in a radio interview. Those were all things that were an extension of the way he was just living his life. So we saw that from the outside, and we saw that from the inside growing up.
Absolutely. That's awesome. Yeah, the cool thing too is you in the business world, you think about one of the biggest challenges that people can have. Like I work with my dad as a dentist, and
Mhm.
my financial advisor was like, you got to be really careful working with family, in business
Yep.
decisions, because so
Yep.
often they lead to failure. But you have co-authored a number of books with your father. What's it like writing a book with your father?
Well, it's funny. I actually haven't counted them, but I think we've done maybe 6 or 8 books together. And each book is unique. So, for example, one book we wrote called The Unshakable Truth, we actually got not really a ghostwriter, but a third party. And we said, pull from all the stuff that we've done and you bring it together. So it's our content, but he was the one who's kind of putting pen to paper, so to speak. Then we would edit and work with it. Evidence That Demands a Verdict, my dad had already compiled that. My job was to bring a team together and update the book that he did. So the last update was in 1999, I think it was. And then this one came out in 2017. So I got a group of 3 dozen graduate students where I teach at Biola, Talbot School of Theology, and about a dozen leading scholars. And really, what I would do is kind of step by step, I just check in with my dad and I'd say, Dad, is this what you think? Do you have any concerns? Do you have any advice? And kind of narrate him through the process. And he guided me as we worked on it. And then he edited, he did some of the writing, and just kind of oversaw the project. So different books that you co-author can have very different arrangements. I wrote a book with William Dembski, and I basically took all his material and just added stories and explained it in a way that people could understand because he's a double PhD. So co-authored books have very different kinds of arrangements. My job was to put this book together, and evidence is different because it's kind of a compilation, an anthology, so to speak, a research book that's out there. So we just needed a team of people to do that extensive, in-depth research, bring it together, and then run it by him to make sure he was happy with it.
So in apologetics, one of my favorite writers is C.S. Lewis, and one of his greatest influences is a Scottish author by the name of George MacDonald. I'm sure you're familiar with him. Lewis states in a quote that, I have never concealed the fact that I've regarded him as my master. Indeed, I fancy that I have never written a book in which I did not quote him. And what I really like about George MacDonald is if you read the preface to C.S. Lewis's George MacDonald anthology, which you should always read prefaces and introductions to books. He says, we have learned from Freud and others about those distortions in character and errors in thought, which result from a man's early conflicts with his father. For the most important thing we know about George MacDonald is that his whole life illustrates the opposite of this process. An almost perfect relationship with his father was the earthly root of all his wisdom. So how would you describe, you've talked about it a little bit, about how your father has influenced your spiritual journey and having that kind of hands-off approach, but also discipling you clearly throughout the years?
It's not even close to think about the people who have influenced me in my life. I've had amazing basketball coaches, mentors, professors who've had a huge impact on my life. But my dad stands out far and above as the most influential in a few ways. My dad is what people see on stage is the way he is off the stage. He is passionate. He is committed. He is all in for the gospel. He really believes it. And to see somebody live a life with just such conviction, it's compelling. So that's one way he's really influenced me. Another way is my dad just has incredible courage. I think of him debating Ahmad Didat in the 80s, who frankly was just vicious and also a very effective apologist. And my dad lovingly just defeated him soundly. And anybody can watch that online if they want to, but he went to South Africa and debated him in person before 3,000 people, prepped for a year. That takes a lot of courage to do something like that. I've seen his boldness. I've also seen the way he just loves and cares for my mom. He really values and cherishes that relationship. He loves and cares and sacrifices for us. And my dad is human and has his faults and insecurities like anybody else does, but especially given the troublesome background that he came from, with an abusive father, experiencing sexual abuse. My father did by someone who lived on their farm. His older sister took her own life. Really painful background. The older I get, the more I realize how powerful and radical it is to come from that background and become a great husband, a great father, and just to do the effective things he's done in ministry. I really credit to the Holy Spirit in his life. So I think I go to him like you described earlier. There's often times that I'm speaking, I'm thinking, how do I navigate this situation? How would you answer this apologetic question? We just have those conversations all the time. But really, more than anything, I think my dad just modeled it, brought us along with what he was doing, built a relationship with us as kids, and just realized that by itself was going to influence the direction we went. And it certainly did in my life.
That's super good. I know in your last video where you're giving an update on your health, you talked about some of the precedent that your father has set, just in the accomplishments that he's done as an apologist, but also just what you're talking about in his accomplishments of being a good father. Do you feel a sort of spiritual burden to come from a household and background that comes with that?
There's some people that have tried to put that burden upon me, uh, realizing it or not realizing it. My parents have never put that burden on me. Maybe early on when I was starting in ministry, I remember one of the first times I spoke, somebody goes, "And welcome, Josh McDowell." I'm like, great. This is like when my dad was at the height of his ministry. I had probably spoken a dozen times. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is like a weight. How can I possibly do this? So early on, maybe I felt that some, but I really don't feel a huge weight and a burden there. My job, I share this story all the time, and I showed it in the video you were talking about, is I asked Os Guinness what, his legacy was going to be. And he said, Sean, legacy is a secular idea. All my job is to be faithful. And so God says, well done, my good and faithful servant. And honestly, Mike, I feel that way. I realize God has given me certain gifts. He's given me certain opportunities. I'm well aware that to write a book like Evidence That Demands a Verdict, I wasn't just some random guy. I am the author's son. I get all that. But all I can control is if I'm faithful to the opportunities God has given me. And that's all that matters to me. I don't compare myself to other authors. I don't compare myself to my father. So that's what's really freeing about this. So I don't have to be the next Josh McDowell. That's a losing game. All I have to be is who has God designed me to be. And I'm telling you, that's just such a freeing place to be. So there have been seasons where I felt that burden, but as a whole, I really don't.
We talked a little bit about your ministry, your father's ministry. In today, it's very easy to put an emphasis, especially I feel like on social media related ministries, because there's a lot of numbers associated with it, and it's deeply embedded into our culture. However, what do you feel like is the most important ministry that you involve yourself in?
Ministering to my wife and my kids.
I love
That's
that.
the easiest question anybody has ever asked me. Being a dad, I just got an email yesterday that said, Sean, I want to make sure you're coaching your son's 5th grade basketball team. I'm like, of course, that's vital. Not going to miss that. That's my number one ministry. That's what my dad did. Now, does that mean I do it perfectly? Absolutely not. I fall short all the time. But my goodness, I couldn't have the strength to go speak and do the other stuff that I did if I didn't have a good relationship with my kids and a good relationship with my wife. I would feel like a fraud and it would gut me. So I've told my wife many times, I've said, especially when we were growing up, not when we were growing up, we were, although I did know her back in 3rd grade, when we were, I guess you could say, grown up as a marriage, when we were first married and I had to go speak at times. We were on the same team because that's how she was able to be a stay-at-home mom. And sometimes that was a burden on her. And I'd tell her, I'd say, your ministry is more important than mine. And I mean it. I've told my wife, I said, if this ministry that I'm in, if I just get tunnel vision and miss it, and it's negatively affecting our ministry, I will step back and cut back, or I will stop doing it and prioritize our family, period. Now, that doesn't mean that wouldn't be a painful decision because I love all the other things I do, but I would. There's no question about it. If somebody said all your ministry over here or your marriage, I'd be like, holy cow, that's the second easiest question to what you asked me. Actually, that probably would be the first easiest question, come to think about it. Now, that's probably not what you were looking for, but I guess I would say I teach, which I love. I speak, which I love. I write. Writing is probably the hardest for me. That comes least naturally, that I have to work at and discipline myself through. But I probably hear more results from people about YouTube than anything else because it's easy to access, it's free. People around the world watch that and really appreciate it. That's
Right.
a little newer for me, so I'm having a lot of fun doing that. But I wouldn't do any of the other things if I honestly didn't enjoy them. I'm turning 50 in 3 years. And if I wasn't getting life and joy and out of what I do in any of those ministries, I would stop them.
Yeah, actually, that was exactly the answer that I was hoping you
Okay.
would
All right.
say.
All right.
I was having this conversation actually with Nancy Piercy, going over her new book, The Toxic War on Masculinity. And she talks about just the changes. I know you interviewed her as well, that with how masculinity was perceived over time. And one of the things that I feel like I'll hear, especially in conservative Christian circles, is speaking negatively about sort of quote unquote career women, as it were, that devote their lives to a career as opposed to staying home with children. But one of the things that struck me as I was reading her book is it seems like a big problem is not just the career woman, it's the career man that doesn't spend a lot of time with his children, that his main goal is his career, whether it's, you know, something that is good, like a ministry, like a lot of the things that you got going on. But as you said, the most important thing is what's right in front of you. It's discipling. It's following the Great Commission in a very intimate level. What do you think are some ways that men need to do to avoid becoming career men?
I think it ultimately starts in the heart. It starts with where your values are. If your identity is in making money or your career, your family is going to suffer. If your family, and obviously serving the Lord through your family, is your priority, then you're going to find a way to balance the two. Now, it is harder for some people than others. I get that. Economically, some people have to work more. Like, I get those dynamics. And so I have a lot of compassion and sympathy for people who feel like I have to work a second job and a third job, and my family suffers. Sometimes you got to do what you got to do. I understand that. But more than anything else, it starts in the heart. So anybody who's a workaholic who says, "Oh, I wish I spent more time with my family and I feel bad," at root, you're going to find something deep about their identity, deep about their values in life that's not rooted in Christ and not focused first on reaching your family. So we could talk details, we could talk strategies and plan how to do all this stuff, but it's really a heart issue. And so if a dad loves and wants to be there with his family, he's going to find a way to do it. Think about it this way. I remember people said, well, when you start college, you get the freshman 15. Well, when you start a job, you're going to gain weight. Well, when you get married, you're going to gain weight. When you have kids, you're going to gain weight. Well, I understand there's challenges for some people, but I actually enjoy working out. It's important for me. So I consistently found time to do so. Even if my kids were napping, I'm like, okay, I'm going to knock out 50 push-ups. Just because that was important to me, I found a way to stay in shape. If your family is important to you, you're going to find a way to value and spend time with them, period.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And I'm going to steal something from my dad. This is an illustration that I heard from him, and it's a math problem. So nobody click away just because it's math.
Hey,
This
my
is
wife's
really
a math
simple.
teacher, so
Oh,
maybe I'll share
perfect.
this with her later.
Awesome. Yeah. So I'm just going to read it here. So let's say every person made 2 disciples. So, like, if you're a father, you're going to have 2 disciples. If you're a mother, you're going to have 2 more disciples. So that'd be 4 children total. If they're your own children, if you don't have children, you just make 2 other disciples. But if those children or people or whoever, those 2 disciples were true disciples, and they go on to produce other disciples in a similar manner, so just 2 more, roughly how many disciples would be made in 40 generations? And for context, 40 generations is about 1,000 years. So it's a long time. It's short on the lifespan, you know, of the earth here. And that's using a 25-year generation period. So how many disciples would be made, just ballpark, in 40 generations?
Are you really asking me to do the math?
No, you're good. Yeah, so it's 500 billion, more people than have ever lived on the earth, basically. And so that's the power of what you're talking about in making discipleship of your family the primary ministry. One of the things that I really liked in your book, your newest book, I believe, Set Adrift, is you talked about some of the doubts that you were having with your faith and your interaction with your dad and his response. Do you mind sharing just a little bit on that?
I don't mind at all. Yeah, I think I was about 19, 20 years old. It kind of started the end of my freshman into my sophomore year, around that period. So it's like the mid 90s. And I just remember I was getting on the internet. And this is when, like, the internet was kind of new. There was no Google yet, but we're trying to figure out, what is this thing and what does it mean to search and what's an email address? And so I'm kind of searching around on these rudimentary websites, and I came across this website, part of kind of the atheist secular web, that was taking my dad's book, Evidence Demands Verdict, the one you showed earlier, chapter by chapter, and responding to it. Doctors, historians, lawyers. And when I saw that at the time, that was the first I'd really seen smart, thoughtful people push back on the kind of apologetics that my father had advanced. That was really unsettling to me. That was the first time I remember having the thought, wow, I could be wrong about this. I thought through what it meant relationally, thought through what it meant in the afterlife. Like all those things are going through my mind. And I went to my father. We were in Breckenridge, Colorado. And we're on, I think, family vacation there. And I just wanted to share with him kind of the journey I was going through. And as best I can remember, we're out for coffee. And I just said, Dad, I want to know what's true, but I don't know if I'm convinced that Christianity is really true. And put yourself in my shoes. I know my dad loves me, but he spent his life defending and advancing the Christian faith. And his son's like, I'm not sure that I buy this. And he looks at me and he doesn't hesitate, Mike. He just says, son, I think that's great. And I remember thinking, like, Dad, did you even hear what I just said? Like, are you listening and writing a talk in your head? He goes, no. He goes, you can't live on my convictions. You got to decide for yourself what you think is true. He said, now don't reject what you've learned growing up unless you really think it's not true. Follow truth. And, you know, your mom and I love you no matter what. Something to that effect. And on some level, I don't like to over dramatize that, but that was a very significant moment in my life where I thought, okay, this makes sense. I've got to decide what I believe. And I just remember at that point asking a lot of questions. Since then, read the Quran, the Book of Mormon, started reading a bunch of atheist books, just saying, does this make sense? Can I find answers to it? Now, I was at Biola University at that time, and J.P. Moreland was a professor. He's now a colleague of mine. I'd go to his office hours and talk with him. So I was blessed with some pretty thoughtful people in my life. And of course, William Lane Craig was starting to come at about that time. And so I think that I consider that a pivotal time where I started to really own my own faith, so to speak. And the other thing that's interesting about that is I remember growing up thinking, you know, if God's ever going to use me, I got to have some dramatic testimony, because people would come out of prison, they'd come out of war, they'd be in a gang, you know, and like, I'm thinking, gosh, I have such a boring, normal life. Grew up, my parents are missionaries. And it never occurred to me that going through the season of doubt would just be something that God would use to encourage other people who go through doubt, or parents whose kids go through doubt. That means all of our stories are important. There's going to be other people who go through the same things that we do. And so if we're able to seek after truth, trust God through this process, God will use us to encourage other people.
Absolutely. And even that situation too, just if I was to think about how I would respond if my children were to come to me in you know years to come, if you can respond built on a relationship of love that's
Amen.
been there for years, that carries so much more weight than really anything else. Even if you have like all the answers, like, okay, let's go through them. But the fact, like, it wasn't just his response that struck me. It was the fact also that you went to him and were comfortable enough. You know, my dad is this figure in ministry, but I know this is going to disappoint him, but I know this is what is right, and even what he would want to a degree. So the fact even that you would go to him with those doubts speaks to the strength of both of your relationship, I think. So you talked about the website that you got onto, the atheist website. Do you think with the prevalence of even more online media today, do you think it's harder to raise kids today? And what do you think parents can do to combat a lot of these influences that are out there?
You know, it's an interesting question. Is it harder or not? I think it's always been hard to pass on your faith to the next generation. I think what I would say is the kinds of concerns that parents had in the 80s and the 90s when I was growing up, if anything, have only been exacerbated in a couple ways. Number one, I think our culture is arguably more against a Judeo-Christian ethic. Rosaria Butterfield, in a recent book, calls it an anti-Christian age. And I think there's something to that. So when I was growing up, people didn't follow the Christian worldview necessarily, but there was a certain respect and admiration for those who did. Now, if you follow Christian ethic, in particular on issues of sexuality, you are bigoted, you're hateful, you are harming people. So raising a generation of young people that are not just kind of tolerated, but are considered bigots is a very different metric, so to speak. But second, you take what the internet does, and smartphones quite literally change everything. So I didn't really uncover challenges to the faith until I'm in college. Well, now this is coming across TikTok, this is coming across Instagram Reels, it's coming across. Just yesterday, I was with a group of high school students talking about artificial intelligence, and they pulled out Snapchat, and there's this new algorithm built in a Snapchat you can't avoid with artificial intelligence. And we asked it some questions, and there were certain biases that definitely are against a Christian worldview, as subtly as they can make it, built into that algorithm. And I pointed out to the students, Netflix, Disney. So the culture milieu has changed, and there's more tools pushing this at a younger age to this generation than in the past. And I think the other piece that also has increased is, ironically, with more tools of communication, we have greater loneliness. We have increased mental health issues. They were prevalent in the 80s and 90s, but not to the level today. So I think you start to couple some of those together, and I think you could make a case that there are more challenges to raising kids today and protecting them in age-appropriate ways from some of the corruption that can often seep through in our world than there was in the past.
There's an instinct to, and it's a good reflex and instinct to have, to protect your children from certain things, and we absolutely need to do that. One of the things that I really liked, it was in chapter 7 of your book that you co-wrote, So the Next Generation Will Know. You talked about a worldview missions trip, which is kind of it's not the opposite of protecting your children, but do you mind elaborating a little bit on that?
I'd be happy to. By the way, you've done your homework. You're quoting evidence demands verdict, set adrift, so the next generation will know. Good prep, Mike. I do appreciate that. I try to do the same with my guests. So this was not first my idea. J. Warner Wallace, my co-author in that book, initially had that idea. Brett Kunkel from Maven is the one who started pulling off those trips at the beginning, still takes groups on those trips, and took us initially when we started going. But the idea is kind of to inoculate young people with some of the ideas in the world. So we started taking trips to Berkeley, to Salt Lake City. And when we go to Berkeley, bring in outspoken atheists. Some people like Richard Carrier, who were outspoken at the time, a PhD, really thoughtful atheist who's debated William Lane Craig. We bring him into our group. We bring in other atheists from the kind of the Bay Area at the time. Things have shifted. We brought in some LGBTQ activists and have them speak to our students. We've gone to campus and met with some atheist and skeptical groups on campus. And we just train our students. How do you ask good questions? How do you treat people respectfully who see the world differently? And how do you defend your faith? And then we take students, give them surveys, and set them out on the Berkeley campus to just go get in conversations with other students. And what's great about this is J. Warner Wallace, again, my co-author on that, he would say he has a background as a detective and in the police force. He'd say we need to stop teaching. We need to start training. So when you teach something in church, if there's no test that's coming up, there's no sense of urgency. But if somebody is going into a fight, in 6 months, I've got this fight on the books, I got to start training. Or if somebody in the police force is like, this isn't just head knowledge, we're going to take you out to go, interact with some bad guys, you better know your stuff. So that's kind of what this Berkeley and Utah trip type, experience does is here's on the calendar, we're bringing an atheist. We're going to knock on the door on Mormons. And students start thinking, oh, I got to know my stuff. I got to read. I got to prepare. And then there's a real world environment. Sometimes they get beat up a little bit in the sense that they don't have an answer. They're frazzled. They come back and we debrief and we talk about it. So there's just so many elements of that that students enjoy. So our challenge in that book is to help youth leaders think, move away from just entertaining, move away from just minimal teaching, and challenge kids and raise the bar. And I think you'd be amazed at how many would respond.
Absolutely. You know, I feel like just generally there's a movement to bring whatever's most exciting for youth kids, and there's really few things more exciting than doing what you're talking about, than just
Totally.
going out and talking to people who don't think the same that you do, and
Yep.
the training aspect of that too, getting ready for that. If I was to go play football with a bunch of NFL players, I can try way harder than them, but I'm going to get absolutely destroyed. And they're probably going to be barely even trying because they're trained to do it, you know? So
True.
I love that idea. Also, in your book, The Rebels Manifesto, you write that if all people are made in the image of God, as Jesus taught, then political activism should be concerned with the welfare of our fellow human beings. In his letter to the Israelites in Babylonian captivity, the prophet Jeremiah instructed them to build homes, plant gardens, marry and have kids, and to seek the welfare of the city. And what's interesting to me, this really stuck out because you're quoting Jeremiah chapter 29 here. And one of my favorite letters written by Dietrich Bonhoeffer also quotes the same passage. So I'm going to quote a section from that.
Sure.
It says, when I think about the situation of the world, the complete darkness over our personal fate and my personal imprisonment, and he's writing this to his fiance as well. So he says, then I believe that our union can only be a sign of God's grace and kindness, which calls us to faith. We would be blind if we did not see it. Jeremiah says, at the moment of his people's great need, still one shall buy houses and acres in this land as a sign of trust in the future. This is where faith belongs. May God give it to us daily. And I do not mean the faith which flees the world, but the one that endures the world and which loves and remains true to the world in spite of all the suffering which it contains for us. So what are some ways that you think Christians can disciple and prepare the next generation to not just have a faith that flees the world, but one that endures the world and loves and remains true in spite of all the suffering which it may contain for us?
So I've been studying faith transmission since the early 2000s, probably 2 decades, reading every book I can get my hands on by Christian Smith, Kara Powell, Gene Twenge, you name it. And I think it's fair to say that if you want to pass on your faith to the next generation, there's 3 things in sum you need to do. Number 1, you have to model a faith that is compelling and captivating. Not perfect, but an authentic faith that a young person looks at that and says, there's something about your life that I want. And that's true for marriage. I remember looking at my parents thinking, God, they're authentic, they're real, they believe this. This is a meaningful life. There's something about that I want. So you have to model it. Number 1, if you don't model the Christian faith, it doesn't matter what else you say or do in the vast majority of circumstances. Number 1, model. Number 2, like you said earlier, Mike, build a relationship with your kids. Build an intimate, close relationship. Statistically speaking, the number 1 factor of faith transmission, and I could give all the studies behind this if you wanted it. We document it in the book you're talking about, is a, quote, warm relationship with the father. That doesn't make the mother unimportant. The mother is vital, but the father's more of a wild card, so to speak. Number 1, you got to model it. Number 2, you have to have a warm, meaningful, intimate relationship. And number 3, engage the next generation in meaningful spiritual conversations. Regular, meaningful spiritual conversations to help build their worldview and their understanding of the world so they can navigate it from within their Christian faith. That's what we need to do. Now, when you say in a world in which there's pain, on that 3rd step, sometimes we communicate a theology that's really kind of the prosperity gospel. In evangelical churches, if you just follow Jesus, he'll give you that perfect wife, he'll give you that job, he'll give you fill in the blank. That's not biblical theology. And so if your theology is Jesus wants to bless me, and I understand that through an American materialistic lens, and then I go through pain, of course I'm going to question or abandon the Christian faith. But if my worldview says God promises he's going to be with us, and the resurrection is the first fruits of the heaven that is yet to come, but we live in a broken world. And Jesus says, pick up your cross and follow me. And Christians are going to suffer like those in the world. And in fact, maybe we'll suffer more. But when we suffer, it's that we suffer with joy, we suffer with hope, and that will be a meaningful witness to the world. Then when suffering comes along, you don't question your faith. So that's what I think, all things considered, is our best odds of passing on the faith to the next generation in a world full of pain.
I love that answer. And especially with how you started too, in looking at yourself and your own personal obedience, because a moral failure incentivizes an intellectual failure, especially for your kids, because they're going to be the first ones to notice our hypocrisy, our failures. And if we live like that, or we don't confess it and we don't repent from it, then that distortion in character as a father reflects on even the character and nature of God, because we give, in a way, a reflection of that relationship between child and father, and distort it when we are hypocrites and fail morally. So thank you so much for taking the time to answer all these questions and for putting the hard work. You said you don't like to write, but I don't get that from the host of books that you've written a lot together. So thank you again for putting all those resources together. I'm excited to see what your kids do in the future. Where can people find you on social media and buy your books?
First off, thanks for great, thoughtful questions. I appreciate the time you put into this interview. You can find my books on any bookseller. Probably a central hub would just be SeanMcDowell.org. There's a link to my blog, link to my YouTube channel, where I'm on Instagram, Twitter, now X. Like, that kind of connects different things. My speaking schedule is there. Sometimes people look in there and go, oh my goodness, he's speaking near me and come, which is fun to meet folks who maybe hear me in this channel or something else. That would be the hub place. And there's also links to the books through my site. So probably SeanMcDowell.org would be the most helpful place to start.
Awesome. And if anybody does buy a book, and you should, or if you already own the book, go and write a review and give it a good rating. If you want to get these kinds of materials out, it's important for, Amazon algorithms, whatever platform you're using to purchase these things, to write reviews, to review it favorably if you like it, so that other people, it'll be promoted to them as well. So Dr. McDowell, I thank you so much for your time again, for coming on the channel and answering some of these questions.
Thanks for having me.